At 30,000 feet, she hadn't spoken a single word all flight. Just another forgettable passenger in 14A. Until both engines died and the pilot screamed Mayday into his radio. That's when the silent woman stood up, walked to the cockpit, and revealed who she really was. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737 cruised smoothly through the crystalline air at 30,000 feet, its twin engines humming with mechanical precision as flight attendants began their beverage service down the narrow aisle. In seat 14A, pressed against the window where afternoon sunlight painted golden streaks across her lap, sat a woman who had not spoken a single word since boarding at Denver International 2 hours earlier. Her name was Dr. Sarah Chen, though nobody on the aircraft knew this, and her silence had become so absolute that even the flight attendants had stopped attempting conversation beyond the most minimal gestures. She was 38 years old with dark hair pulled back in a functional ponytail, wearing unremarkable jeans and a gray sweater that allowed her to disappear completely into the visual background of commercial air travel. When she had first settled into her seat, the middle-aged businessman in 14B had attempted friendly conversation about the weather and their respective destinations, receiving only a brief, polite smile and a slight nod in response before Sarah turned her attention to the window and the vast expanse of clouds below. The businessman had tried once more, commenting on the smoothness of the takeoff, but when Sarah responded with another wordless nod and immediately closed her eyes as though preparing to sleep, he had taken the hint and buried himself in his laptop for the remainder of the flight. The flight attendant named Jessica had noticed Sarah during the initial boarding process, watching as the quiet passenger moved efficiently down the aisle with only a small backpack, stowing it quickly in the overhead compartment before sliding into her window seat without fuss or conversation. During the safety demonstration, Jessica had observed that Sarah paid no attention whatsoever to the presentation, instead staring out the window with an expression that seemed simultaneously distant and intensely focused, as though she were calculating something far more important than the location of emergency exits. When Jessica had approached with the beverage cart an hour into the flight, she had asked Sarah what she would like to drink, and Sarah had simply pointed to the tomato juice and held up one finger, nodding her thanks when the plastic cup was handed to her. Jessica had found the interaction slightly unsettling in its minimalism but had quickly dismissed it as just another passenger who preferred to be left alone, the kind of traveler who wore their desire for privacy like armor against the forced intimacy of commercial aviation. The woman in 14C, a college student with headphones perpetually wedged in her ears, had likewise given up any attempt at acknowledgement after Sarah failed to respond to two separate "excuse me" requests when the student needed to squeeze past to use the restroom, receiving only a wordless shift of Sarah's knees to allow passage. What none of them knew, what Sarah's absolute silence and withdrawn demeanor concealed so effectively, was that she had logged over 4,000 hours in some of the most challenging aircraft ever designed, including 12 years as a test pilot for Boeing's Emergency Systems Division, where her primary responsibility had been deliberately inducing catastrophic failures and then recovering from them. She held advanced certifications in engine-out procedures, asymmetric thrust management, and emergency glide optimization that represented expertise possessed by perhaps 200 people worldwide. Her doctoral dissertation had focused on powerplant failure recovery at high altitude, and she had spent 3 years training military pilots in single-engine operations for twin-engine fighters where engine failure meant either perfect execution or death. She had flown the prototype 787 Dreamliner with one engine completely disabled at altitudes ranging from sea level to 41,000 feet, mapping the precise glide characteristics and optimal configurations for maximum range without power. She had practiced emergency engine restart procedures in aircraft whose engines had been deliberately contaminated, overheated, and mechanically sabotaged to create every conceivable failure scenario. She had landed multi-engine aircraft with complete hydraulic failures, electrical failures, and flight control malfunctions that would have killed less experienced pilots within seconds. But today she was simply a passenger, traveling to Seattle for her mother's 75th birthday, and she had chosen silence because after 12 years of constant communication, endless technical debriefs, and the relentless verbal precision required in test flying, she craved the peace of not speaking at all. The aircraft continued its smooth cruise as the beverage service concluded and passengers settled into the drowsy afternoon rhythm of cross-country flight. The captain, a veteran pilot named Michael Rodriguez with 22 years of experience and over 15,000 flight hours, monitored his instruments from the left seat of the cockpit while his first officer, Amanda Walsh, handled radio communications with Denver Center. The engines purred with the reliable monotony that made commercial aviation statistically the safest form of transportation ever devised, their titanium turbine blades spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute, compressing air and mixing it with fuel in a carefully controlled explosion that generated thrust with extraordinary efficiency. The aircraft's two CFM International engines had been inspected and certified just 72 flight hours earlier, showing no signs of unusual wear or impending failure. The weather ahead was clear, with only scattered cumulus clouds dotting the landscape below like cotton balls spread across a vast blue tablecloth. Everything about the flight was routine, unremarkable, the kind of smooth operation that happened thousands of times daily across the world's commercial aviation network without incident or drama. Sarah had just closed her eyes, allowing the engine vibrations to lull her into a light doze, when the entire aircraft shuddered violently. The sound came first as a deep, catastrophic bang that resonated through the fuselage like a massive drum being struck by a sledgehammer, followed immediately by a teeth-rattling vibration that made overhead compartments rattle and passengers gasp in shock. Sarah's eyes snapped open instantly, her body already tensing with recognition even as her mind raced through diagnostic possibilities. The number 2 engine, the one mounted on the right wing just visible through her window, had suddenly begun trailing dark. Smoke and flames, its normal smooth rotation clearly disrupted as the turbine blades inside the housing disintegrated from what appeared to be an uncontained engine failure. She watched with professional detachment as the engine tore itself apart, metal fragments punching through the engine cowling in a catastrophic cascade that happened within seconds. The aircraft immediately began yawing to the right as the asymmetric thrust tried to push the plane off course, and she felt the pilots correcting with rudder input to maintain directional control. Passengers around her screamed and pointed at the window, panic spreading through the cabin like wildfire as people realized something terrible had happened to the engine. In the cockpit, Captain Rodriguez was already executing emergency procedures with the mechanical precision drilled into commercial pilots through thousands of hours of simulator training. The master warning lights had illuminated across his panel, accompanied by the urgent chimes that indicated critical systems failures. His right engine's instruments showed catastrophic failure, with exhaust gas temperatures pegged at maximum, rapidly falling RPM, and vibration levels that exceeded all safety parameters. He immediately reached for the engine fire handle, pulling it to shut off fuel flow and activate the fire suppression system, while simultaneously calling out "engine failure, engine fire, right engine" to his first officer. Amanda was already pulling out the quick reference handbook, flipping to the engine failure procedure checklist as she keyed the radio. Denver Center, Southwest 447, declaring an emergency, "We have an uncontained engine failure on the right engine with fire indication, requesting immediate vectors for emergency landing." The controller's voice came back immediately, professional and calm despite the urgency. Southwest 447, roger your emergency, squawk 7700, turn left heading 270, vectors for Denver International, emergency equipment will be standing by. But then something happened that transformed a serious but manageable emergency into a nightmare scenario that violated every expectation of how aircraft systems were supposed to function. As Captain Rodriguez reached down to ensure the right engine fuel lever was in the cutoff position, the left engine suddenly surged, coughed, and then fell silent. The steady background roar that had been the constant companion of flight simply stopped, replaced by an eerie whistling of wind over the airframe. Both pilots stared at their instruments in disbelief as the left engine's parameters plummeted toward zero. Fuel flow ceased. RPM dropped. Exhaust gas temperature fell. The engine hadn't exploded or caught fire. It had simply quit, as though someone had reached inside and turned it off. "What the hell?" Amanda whispered, her professional composure cracking as she stared at instruments showing both engines completely dead. Captain Rodriguez felt ice water replace the blood in his veins as he realized they had just lost all thrust at 30,000 feet. His hands moved automatically through the restart procedure, pushing the left engine start switch while calling out, "attempting restart, left engine, but the engine refused to respond. The igniters clicked uselessly. No fuel pressure. No rotation. Nothing. Mayday, 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 Southwest 447, we have complete dual engine failure, we have no thrust, both engines are out, we're declaring a Mayday emergency. Captain Rodriguez's voice remained remarkably steady despite the impossible situation now facing him. In his entire career, he had never heard of both engines failing simultaneously on a commercial aircraft in cruise flight except in cases of fuel exhaustion, and his gauges showed plenty of fuel remaining in the tanks. We're at 30,000 feet and descending, we need the closest airport immediately, we're going to need a very long runway. The controller's voice came back with barely controlled urgency. Southwest 447, roger your Mayday, Denver International is your best option, currently 43 nautical miles at your 11 o'clock position, runways 16L and 16 are available, wind calm, altimeter 299er2. Rodriguez did the mental calculation instantly and felt his stomach drop. At optimal glide ratio, the 737 could cover roughly 3 miles for every 1,000 feet of altitude in still air. From 30,000 feet, that gave them perhaps 90 miles of theoretical range, but Denver was 43 miles away and they were already beginning to lose precious altitude. It would be close. Terrifyingly close. In the cabin, absolute pandemonium had erupted. Passengers screamed and clutched their armrests as the aircraft's nose dropped into a descent that felt steeper than any normal approach. The complete absence of engine noise created an unnatural quiet that made the screaming sound even louder, more desperate. Flight attendant Jessica grabbed the PA system handset, her hands shaking as she tried to project calm authority. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We are experiencing a mechanical issue and will be landing shortly. Please listen to your flight attendants for instructions. But her voice cracked on the word issue, and passengers could hear the terror beneath the scripted reassurance. People began crying openly, calling loved ones on their cell phones to say goodbye, praying in whispered voices as the aircraft continued its powerless descent through the sky. The businessman in 14B had gone pale, gripping his armrests so hard his knuckles had turned white, while the college student in 14C sobbed into her hands, her headphones forgotten on the seat beside her. Sarah remained absolutely still, her eyes closed now not in sleep but in concentration as she listened to the aircraft's behavior with senses honed through thousands of hours in similar situations. She could feel the pilots trimming for best glide speed, approximately 250 knots, the sweet spot where the 737's aerodynamics provided maximum lift-to-drag ratio and therefore maximum range without power. She could sense them attempting engine restarts through the subtle vibrations and sounds transmitted through the airframe. She knew without seeing the instruments that they were probably descending at around 1,500 feet per minute, maybe slightly better if the pilots were executing the emergency procedure perfectly. She calculated distances and altitudes in her head automatically, muscle memory from hundreds of simulated engine-out emergencies. At this rate, they had perhaps 18 minutes of flight time remaining before they reached ground level, and if Denver was 40-plus miles away, they needed every second of that glide and absolutely perfect execution to make the airport. She opened her eyes and looked out the window at the smoking remains of the right engine, then forward through the cabin toward the cockpit door. For a long moment she wrestled with herself, her desire for continued silence and anonymity warring with the professional knowledge that two commercial pilots, no matter how experienced, might not have the specialized training for this specific nightmare scenario. Test pilots practiced dual-engine failures repeatedly, learning the subtle tricks and techniques that extracted every possible foot of range from a powerless aircraft. She knew things about the 737's glide characteristics that weren't in any manual, learned through actual experience rather than simulator approximations. She knew how to squeeze an extra half-mile of range through precise speed and configuration management. She knew backup restart procedures that went beyond the standard checklist, alternative methods that sometimes worked when conventional approaches failed. She knew how to prepare for a landing without powered flight controls, using manual reversion techniques that required different sight pictures and muscle memory than normal approaches. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movements smooth and purposeful despite the aircraft's descent. The businessman beside her looked up in shock. "Sit down. Didn't you hear the announcement? We're crashing." But Sarah ignored him, moving quickly down the aisle toward the front of the aircraft. Jessica saw her approaching and immediately moved to intercept, her training requiring her to keep passengers seated during an emergency. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat immediately, we're in an emergency situation." Sarah stopped, looking directly at the flight attendant, and when she spoke her voice was calm, clear, and carried absolute authority. "I need to speak to the captain immediately. I'm a test pilot with extensive engine-out emergency training. I may be able to help them with the recovery procedures." Jessica stared at her in confusion, this woman who hadn't spoken a single word during the entire flight suddenly claiming expertise that seemed impossible. "Ma'am, I can't let you into the cockpit, even during an emergency, FAA regulations," Sarah cut her off. "If they don't make Denver Airport, everyone on this aircraft dies. I have 4,000 hours flying aircraft with deliberate engine failures. I wrote training protocols for dual engine failure recovery. Call them and ask if they want my help. Do it now." Something in Sarah's tone, the absolute confidence and lack of panic, made Jessica hesitate for only a second before grabbing the cockpit phone. She spoke briefly, listened, then hung up and looked at Sarah with wide eyes. "They want to know your credentials." Sarah recited them quickly. Dr. Sarah Chen, former chief test pilot for Boeing Emergency Systems Division, 12 years conducting engine-out testing, certified in emergency procedures for all Boeing narrow-body aircraft, doctoral research in powerplant failure recovery at altitude, FAA distinguished pilot certification with special emphasis on emergency operations. "I've flown this exact aircraft type with no engines more times than your pilots have probably practiced it in simulators. Let me help them." Jessica made another brief call, and when she hung up the cockpit door lock clicked open. "They said come in, but they're continuing emergency procedures whether you can help or not." Sarah nodded and moved to the cockpit door, pushing it open and stepping into the cramped space behind the pilot's seats. Captain Rodriguez glanced back at her, his face grim and focused. "If you're really who you say you are, we can use help. We've tried every restart procedure in the book and neither engine will light up. We're at 26,000 feet with 41 miles to Denver. I'm not sure we're going to make it." Sarah squeezed into the small space behind the center console, her eyes rapidly scanning the instruments to build a complete picture of the aircraft's systems and status. Right engine destroyed, that much was obvious. Left engine showed no damage but also no operation, sitting cold and dead despite adequate fuel pressure, electrical power, and no indication of mechanical failure. Configuration was clean, flaps and gear retracted. Speed steady at 250 knots. Descent rate 1,500 feet per minute. Heading toward Denver, battery power still available. Hydraulic systems were degrading as the engine-driven pumps weren't operating, but the RAT, the ram air turbine, should deploy automatically to provide emergency hydraulic and electrical power. She looked at the auxiliary power unit controls. "Have you tried starting the APU to get additional electrical power and bleed air for an engine start?" Amanda looked back at her. "Trying now, but it's not responding either. We're getting no rotation on the APU." Sarah's mind raced through possibilities. Triple simultaneous failures of two engines and the APU suggested either catastrophic fuel contamination, which made no sense given the right engine had exploded rather than simply quit, or some kind of catastrophic damage to multiple systems from the uncontained engine failure. She leaned forward to look at the fuel system indicators. "Check your fuel filter bypass lights. If the right engine threw debris that damaged fuel lines, you might have contamination in the fuel system that's causing the left engine and APU to refuse to start." Rodriguez checked the indicator. "Fuel filter bypass light is illuminated. You think we've got contaminated fuel?" Sarah nodded grimly. The uncontained failure on the right engine probably threw metal debris that punctured fuel lines or damaged fuel system components. That contamination might be preventing the left engine from starting because the fuel control unit is detecting particles and automatically shutting down to prevent damage. It's a safety feature that's currently killing us. She reached forward and pointed to a guarded switch on the overhead panel. That's the fuel filter bypass override. It's not in your standard emergency checklist because it's only used in situations where contaminated fuel is your only option. If we bypass the filters, the engine might ingest contaminated fuel and be damaged or even fail catastrophically, but since we're going to crash in about 15 minutes anyway if we don't get some thrust, I think it's worth the risk. Rodriguez looked at her, making a split-second decision to trust this stranger who had materialized in his cockpit claiming expertise he desperately needed. He flipped the guard up and activated the bypass switch. Okay, fuel filters bypassed. Amanda, run the engine start procedure again, left engine. His first officer moved through the sequence, pushing the start switch and advancing the fuel lever. For several agonizing seconds nothing happened, and then suddenly they heard the most beautiful sound imaginable, the whine of the left engine beginning to spool up. The N1 gauge began climbing as the turbine accelerated. Fuel flow resumed. Exhaust gas temperature rose into the normal range. The engine caught, steadied, and began producing thrust. The cockpit erupted in relieved exclamations as thrust returned and the aircraft's descent slowed. Yes. We have thrust on the left engine, we're back in business. Amanda's voice shook with emotion as she watched the engine stabilize. But Sarah held up a warning hand. You need to be extremely careful with thrust application. That engine is running on contaminated fuel through bypassed filters. It could fail again at any moment if metal particles damage the turbine blades or fuel control systems. Keep thrust as low as possible to maintain level flight or a very shallow descent. Don't try to climb. And be ready to deal with another failure. Rodriguez nodded, his brief moment of relief tempered by her words. Understood. Southwest 447 to Denver Center, we have successfully restarted one engine and have partial thrust restored. Still need priority landing but situation improved. Currently at 23,000 feet, 34 miles from field. The controller's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Southwest 447, outstanding news, you're cleared for any approach to any runway at Denver, emergency equipment remains standing by. Sarah settled into a small jump seat behind the pilots, strapping in as she continued analyzing their situation. You're going to want to configure for landing as late as possible to maximize your glide range in case the engine quits again. When you do extend flaps, do it in small increments and immediately compensate with thrust to maintain your glide path. If the engine fails during configuration changes, you could end up in a situation where you're too slow and too low with too much drag to make the airport. Also, your hydraulic systems are degraded, so your flight controls are going to feel heavier than normal and may not respond as crisply as you're used to. Be prepared for that during the flare and landing. Rodriguez appreciated the advice, recognizing immediately that she understood the cascade of complications that could arise from partial systems failures. We're planning to use the longest runway, 16R, 12,000 feet of concrete. With one engine we should be able to make a reasonably normal approach and landing if nothing else goes wrong. The aircraft continued its descent toward Denver, now under partial power, with passengers in the cabin gradually realizing that the terrible silence had been replaced by the blessed sound of one engine running. The panic began to subside into nervous relief, though many passengers continued crying or holding hands with strangers, the shared near-death experience creating instant bonds. Flight attendants moved through the cabin ensuring everyone was properly secured, preparing for what would still be an emergency landing with potential for further complications. Jessica kept glancing toward the cockpit, wondering what the quiet passenger from 14A could possibly be saying to the pilots that had resulted in such a dramatic change in their situation. At 15,000 feet and 20 miles from Denver, the left engine suddenly hiccuped, its power output fluctuating as contaminated fuel apparently caused momentary combustion irregularities. Sarah saw it immediately on the gauges. You've got fluctuations in fuel flow and EGT. The contamination is starting to affect engine performance. You need to prepare for the possibility of complete loss of the remaining engine. Rodriguez felt sweat beading on his forehead. They were close now, tantalizingly close to Denver International, but still several miles out and several thousand feet high. If they lost the remaining engine, they would be back to dead-stick gliding with much less altitude to work with. Amanda, get the before-landing checklist complete, we're going to expedite this approach. I want to be in a position to land immediately if we lose the engine. His first officer moved through the checklist rapidly, preparing the aircraft for landing while Captain Rodriguez began configuring with flaps. Sarah watched the engine instruments like a hawk as Rodriguez slowly extended flaps in 5-degree increments, adding thrust each time to compensate for the additional drag. 10 degrees. 15 degrees. Each configuration change caused the engine to surge slightly as fuel demands fluctuated, but it continued running. At 10,000 feet and 12 miles out, Denver International's massive runways became visible through the windscreen, the longest commercial runways in North America stretching like gray ribbons across the high plains. Denver Tower, Southwest 447 is 10 miles out, we have the field in sight, we'd like to continue for a visual approach to runway 16R. The tower controller's voice was crisp. Southwest 447, cleared visual approach runway 16R, wind calm, emergency equipment is standing by on all taxiways. At 5 miles and 5,000 feet, with the airport growing steadily larger in the windscreen, disaster struck again. The left engine emitted a grinding vibration that reverberated through the entire airframe, its instruments suddenly showing catastrophic deterioration. Contamination particles had finally worked their way into the turbine section and were destroying the blades from within. Rodriguez felt the thrust dying and instinctively pushed the thrust lever forward, trying to coax more power from the failing engine, but it was futile. The engine made a horrible screeching sound and then fell silent, its turbine section having disintegrated under the assault of metal particles grinding through precision-machined components. The aircraft was dead stick again, this time at 5,000 feet with 5 miles to run to the runway threshold. Sarah did the mental calculation instantly. You have a 3-to-1 glide ratio at best. From 5,000 feet that gives you 15,000 feet of forward distance, which is about 2.5 miles. The runway threshold is 5 miles away. You're not going to make it. You're at least 2 miles short. The cockpit fell silent except for the whistling of wind over the airframe and the urgent beeping of various warning systems. Captain Rodriguez stared at the runway that might as well have been on another planet, mathematical reality making it clear that they would hit the ground well short of the airport. 37 passengers and 5 crew members were going to die in a field somewhere in the flatlands approaching Denver, victims of a 1 in 10 million combination of mechanical failures that had overwhelmed every attempt at recovery. He keyed the PA system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. Brace for emergency landing. Flight attendants prepare the cabin for crash landing. The words came out mechanically, training overriding the terror and despair he felt at having to tell his passengers they were about to crash. But Sarah was not done fighting. She leaned forward urgently. You're not going to make Denver, but there's another option. I saw it on the way in. At your 11 o'clock, about 3 miles out, there's what looked like an airport or airstrip. If we turn toward it now and it's within our glide range, we might be able to put down there instead of crashing into random terrain. Amanda grabbed binoculars from a side pocket and looked where Sarah indicated. I see it. It looks like, it's Front Range Airport, a small general aviation field. I can see a runway, looks like it runs basically north-south. Sarah did more rapid mental calculations. If it's 3 miles away at 11 o'clock, and we're at 4,000 feet now, and if that runway is at least 5,000 feet long, we can make it. But you need to turn now and you need to dump all remaining flaps to minimize drag and maximize glide distance. Rodriguez made an instant decision, banking the aircraft hard left toward the small airport that had suddenly become their only hope for survival. The aircraft, now without any engine thrust and with degraded hydraulics, responded sluggishly to his control inputs, but it turned. Amanda called out the configuration. Speed 220 knots, altitude 3,800 feet, 2.5 miles from Front Range Airport. Sarah watched the descent rate and distance. You're going to make it, but it's going to be close. That runway looks like it's probably 6,000 feet, which is just barely enough for a 737 if you nail the landing and use maximum braking. You're not going to have reverse thrust, you're not going to have full hydraulics for brakes, and you need to touch down within the first 1,000 feet or you'll run off the far end. The small airport grew larger in the windscreen as they descended through 2,000 feet, the runway now clearly visible as a single strip of asphalt surrounded by flat terrain. Rodriguez could see a few small aircraft parked near a terminal building, completely unaware that a commercial airliner was about to make an emergency landing in their midst. Amanda, get on the emergency frequency and notify anyone listening that we're making an emergency landing at Front Range, all aircraft should stay clear. His first officer broadcast the warning even as she kept her eyes locked on their altitude and distance. At 1,000 feet and half a mile out, it became clear they were going to make the runway, but just barely. The aircraft crossed the airport boundary fence at perhaps 50 feet altitude, well below the normal approach path, with Rodriguez fighting to keep the nose up as airspeed bled off. "Come on baby, just a little more, give me just a little more lift," he muttered through gritted teeth. The aircraft crossed the runway threshold at 20 feet, and Rodriguez initiated the flare, pulling back on the yoke to arrest the descent and transition from approach flight to landing attitude. Without engine thrust to cushion the energy management, the landing was going to be firm, but firm was infinitely better than crashing in the dirt. The main wheels contacted the asphalt with a solid thump that resonated through the entire airframe, and Rodriguez immediately deployed spoilers to kill lift and applied maximum braking pressure. The aircraft decelerated rapidly but was still traveling at high speed as it consumed thousands of feet of precious runway. Sarah watched the remaining runway disappear beneath them as Rodriguez stood on the brakes, feeling the aircraft shudder from the extreme braking forces. At the halfway point they were still traveling at 70 knots, too fast, eating up runway at an alarming rate. 3/4 down and still 40 knots, the far end of the runway approaching rapidly with open fields beyond. With perhaps 500 feet of runway remaining, the aircraft finally rolled to a stop, its brakes smoking and tires shredded from the extreme forces, but completely intact and with everyone aboard uninjured. For several seconds nobody in the cockpit moved or spoke, the sudden silence after the sustained emergency seeming unreal. Then Captain Rodriguez let out a long shaky breath and keyed the PA, "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Front Range Airport. Please remain seated until we can conduct an emergency evacuation." He turned to look at Sarah, his eyes showing profound gratitude mixed with continuing disbelief. "I don't know who you are or why you were on my airplane, but you just saved everyone's lives. If you hadn't come into this cockpit when you did, we'd be scattered across a field right now." Sarah nodded quietly, the enormity of what had just happened beginning to settle on her. "You did the flying, Captain. I just provided some information. You and your first officer kept this aircraft under control and brought it down safely." The evacuation proceeded quickly and efficiently, with passengers sliding down emergency chutes onto the grass beside the runway, many of them crying with relief as they touched solid ground. Emergency vehicles from Denver began arriving within minutes, their sirens wailing as they raced to the small airport. Paramedics checked passengers for injuries, finding mostly bruises and minor cuts from the evacuation but no serious trauma. News helicopters appeared overhead within 20 minutes, their cameras capturing images of the damaged 737 sitting on the small airstrip, its right engine destroyed and its left engine showing obvious signs of internal failure. The story of the mysterious quiet passenger who saved the day began spreading through the passenger group, with people asking flight attendants and each other who the woman was who had entered the cockpit during the crisis. Sarah found herself sitting on the grass beside the runway, her legs suddenly feeling shaky now that the adrenaline was wearing off. Jessica approached and sat down beside her, looking at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. 14A. That's where you were sitting. I gave you tomato juice and you didn't say a word. Not one word the entire flight until suddenly you're saving us all. Who are you? Sarah smiled tiredly. I'm someone who really wanted a quiet flight. I spent 12 years talking constantly in cockpits, every word having to be precise and professional, every communication critical to safety. When I left that job 6 months ago, I discovered I didn't want to talk to anyone for a while. I just wanted to be quiet. But some things are more important than personal preferences. Jessica shook her head in amazement. The passengers are calling you the silent angel. They say you appeared out of nowhere and performed a miracle. Captain Rodriguez and First Officer Walsh approached, still in their uniforms but looking exhausted. Rodriguez extended his hand to Sarah. Dr. Chen, I need to officially thank you on behalf of myself, my crew, and every passenger aboard Southwest 447. The NTSB is going to want to interview all of us extensively about what happened today, and I'm going to make absolutely sure they understand that your expertise and quick action were the difference between a successful emergency landing and a mass casualty accident. The fuel system contamination and the bypass procedure you recommended, that's not something we would have thought of or attempted without your guidance. Sarah shook his hand. You trusted me when you had no reason to accept desperation. That took courage. And you flew a perfect powerless approach to a runway you'd never seen before with degraded systems. That took extraordinary skill. The real story here is that 2 professional pilots did everything right under impossible circumstances. The NTSB investigation would eventually reveal that the initial uncontained failure of the right engine had been caused by a microscopic crack in a turbine disc, a defect that had somehow escaped detection during multiple inspections. When the disc failed at high rotation speed, fragments had been expelled with such force that they punctured fuel lines, severed hydraulic connections, and showered metal debris into the aircraft's fuel system. The contamination had made it impossible for the left engine and APU to start using normal procedures because their fuel control units automatically shut down when they detected particles in the fuel supply, a safety feature designed to prevent engine damage from bad fuel. Only by bypassing the filters completely, accepting the risk of engine destruction in exchange for temporary thrust, had they been able to coax the left engine into running long enough to get close to an airport. The fact that Front Range Airport happened to be positioned almost perfectly within the aircraft's glide range after the second engine failure was extraordinary luck, the kind of coincidental alignment that investigators privately acknowledged occurred perhaps once in 10,000 similar scenarios. The story dominated aviation news for weeks, with pilots and engineers analyzing every decision made during the emergency. Sarah gave one press conference at the insistence of both the airline and the NTSB, explaining briefly her background and the technical aspects of what had occurred, then retreated back into quiet privacy, declining further interviews and media requests. She attended her mother's birthday party a week late, after the investigation interviews had concluded, and spent the celebration mostly silent, listening to family conversations and smiling at stories, content to be back in her preferred role as observer rather than participant. The airline offered her free flights for life, which she accepted with a quiet nod of thanks. Captain Rodriguez stayed in touch, sending occasional emails thanking her again and updating her on the career trajectories of passengers who had survived because of that incredible sequence of events at 30,000 feet. 6 months later, Sarah boarded another aircraft for a cross-country flight, settling into a window seat and pulling out a book. When the flight attendant approached offering beverages, Sarah looked up and said clearly, "Tomato juice, please." The flight attendant smiled and poured the drink, and Sarah nodded her thanks. But then, surprising herself, she turned to the passenger beside her and spoke again. "First time flying since the accident?" The passenger, a young man who had been nervously gripping his armrests, looked startled and then nodded. "Yeah. How did you know?" Sarah smiled. "The white knuckles. And the fact you checked your seatbelt about 15 times. Flying is still incredibly safe. What happened on my last flight was a 1 in 10 million occurrence, and even then, everyone survived because pilots train for these scenarios and aircraft are designed with multiple redundancies. You're going to be fine." The young man relaxed slightly, comforted by her words and the calm confidence in her voice. As the aircraft lifted off and climbed toward cruising altitude, Sarah looked out the window at the clouds below and the engines humming smoothly on the wings. She had learned something important during those terrifying minutes at 30,000 feet when she had broken her silence and entered that cockpit. Expertise unused was expertise wasted, and sometimes the most important contribution a person could make was not achieved through words spoken daily but through critical knowledge shared at precisely the moment when it became the difference between life and death. She still valued her quiet spaces and her preference for solitude, but she had learned to balance that against the responsibility that came with possessing specialized knowledge that might someday save lives. The silent passenger had found her voice when it mattered most, and while she might return to silence by choice, she would never again hesitate to speak if speaking meant the difference between disaster and survival. The aircraft continued its climb into the afternoon sky, its engines performing flawlessly, carrying passengers toward their destinations in the routine safety that characterized modern aviation. Sarah closed her eyes and let the familiar vibrations lull her into the light doze of an experienced traveler, secure in the knowledge that both her silence and her voice had their proper place in the world, and that she had learned to recognize when each was needed. 30,000 feet below, the earth turned slowly beneath scattered clouds, and somewhere in Colorado, a grassy field beside a small airport stood as silent testament to an impossible emergency that had ended not in tragedy but in triumph, because a quiet passenger had chosen exactly the right moment to speak.